Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our guests for being here. In celebration of Women's History Month, we are delighted and honored to have with us Liz Brundage and two of her students from Cornell Law School's Avon Global Center for Women and Justice. So Professor Brundage is the executive director of the center. She holds her BA from Yale, as well as a master's in philosophy from Oxford and a JD from Yale Law School. She was awarded the Khosla Memorial Human Dignity Prize for her human rights work and taught law at Yale Law School prior to joining Cornell. She's also the recipient of the Robert L. Bernstein International Human Rights Fellowship to work with the International Association of Women Judges on programs designed to advance women's human rights and access to justice in Southern and East Africa. In fact, I think Liz has spent quite a bit of time in that area. In addition to her work with the center, Professor Brundage also founded and directs the law school's Global Gender Justice Clinic, which I think you're going to hear about today. And in that clinic, students engage in local, global, and transnational efforts to address gender-based violence and discrimination. She has also previously served as an associate legal officer in the appeals chamber of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and has clerked for Judge Kermit Lipez of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, as well as Justice Sandile Nkobo of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. So quite a distinguished career. We also have with us Carolina Morales. Carolina is a 3L at Cornell. She graduated from the Schreier Honors College at Penn State in 2013 with a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and a minor in History. At Cornell, she has been an associate for the Legal Information Institute Supreme Court Bulletin Journal, secretary and third-year representative for the Latino American Law Student Association, and a member of the Global Gender Justice Clinic. Carolina has been working in the clinic on implementing a resolution declaring freedom from domestic violence a human right in Tompkins County by drafting domestic violence in the workplace policies for employers, creating an accompanying toolkit to aid employers in putting the policy into action, and engaging in community outreach and advocacy. Carolina has also worked in the clinic on another project involving the causes and consequence of female imprisonment in Jamaica. She has conducted fieldwork on female incarceration in Jamaica and is currently co-writing a report on that topic. After graduation, Carolina will be working at Duvall and Stachenfield, a real estate firm in New York City. And also we have Alex Gutierrez, also a 3L at Cornell. He's a member of the Global Gender Justice Clinic and is also working on implementing the resolution declaring freedom from domestic violence a human right. Alex graduated from Georgetown University, where he majored in political science. And after graduation from Cornell, he will be joining Paul Hastings in New York City. So we're going to have a presentation, and following that, we'll have questions and answers. Thank you all again for coming. Liz?
So thank you so much, Cliff, for inviting us. Thank you, all of you, for coming and for hosting us here at your beautiful law firm. We're so excited to share a little bit about the work that we do with you all. So I will start by just giving a little bit of background about our center, our clinic, the work that we do, and then talk a little bit about the background of one particular project. And then we'll turn it over to Carolina and Alex to tell a little bit more about the specifics of that project, which is an example, I guess, of bringing some of the global work that we do home to New York State. So, just a bit of background. The Avon Global Center for Women and Justice, which I direct, is a law school research and advocacy center. We work with judges, legal practitioners, academics, and other stakeholders to advance access to justice in an effort to eliminate violence against women and girls. We do that through a number of different programs. We have a gender justice database, a collection of progressive cases from around the world decided by national courts that advance gender justice. We host regular conferences and judicial colloquia of judges, other events that convene different stakeholders to talk about some of the issues, facing women and girls around the world. We we respond to judicial requests from judges from around the world. Many judges outside of the United States don't have the luxury of working with law clerks, and so when they're faced with difficult issues involving gender violence and discrimination, they can come to us, and through our students and our staff, we can assist them with legal research assistance. And then we collaborate with our Global Gender Justice Clinic on cases and projects involving violence and discrimination against women and other gender-related issues. Oops. So then the clinic. So it's easy to get confused between the center and the clinic because the same people direct both. But the clinic is a law school course as well as a public interest law firm. We're part of a broader clinical program at Cornell that really provides a diverse array of legal services, both at home and abroad. The Global Gender Justice Clinic does straddle that kind of jurisdictional divide between we both work locally and we work globally on gender-related issues. We have a number of goals, which I've noted here. Law students work under faculty supervision on practical cases and projects that seek to combat gender-based violence and discrimination. The goals include giving students experience in the wide range of activities in which lawyers engage on behalf of gender rights. They have the opportunity to develop important lawyering skills and to gain substantive knowledge in this area, which we feel, and I think Alex and Carolina can talk more about this, we feel is really relevant, no matter whether they end up pursuing a field directly related to gender justice and human rights, or whether they go into private practice or pursue other opportunities. We think the skills that they gain through the clinic are very applicable broadly, especially given the transnational nature of legal practice today. We also really take advantage of having the opportunity to engage in this work from a reflective perspective. I think often I was a practitioner for a number of years before going back to law school, and or going back to a law school environment. And I think, oftentimes when you're caught up, and I'm sure many of you feel this too, when you're caught up in practice and you're zealously representing your clients, you don't have a whole lot of time to kind of step back and be reflective. And that's something that we feel is really an important part of the clinical work that we do. So we build that into our classes, we build that into our conversations. We think critically about the possible unintended consequences, the challenging issues that are part and parcel of the work that we do. And then we seek, to contribute in a really concrete way to efforts to promote gender justice, both at home and around the world. Just some examples of some of the current projects we're working on. We are currently working with an organization in Myanmar or Burma that is really for the first time, with the opening of things in Myanmar, is having the opportunity to participate in an international process. So Myanmar is up for review by the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And non-governmental organizations have the opportunity to challenge Myanmar's story about the situation of women's rights in the country. And so this grassroots organization there has gone out into the field. They've interviewed hundreds and hundreds, I think around 800 women, who are really at the grassroots experiencing issues of violations of women's health rights, violations of all sorts of gender rights issues. And so we're helping them to translate the information they've gathered into a report for the UN committee. And then our partners and possibly us will go over to Geneva in July and engage with that UN process. As Carolina mentioned, or as Cliff mentioned in talking about Carolina's work, we're working on a study of the causes and consequences of women's imprisonment in Jamaica. That's a fact-finding and reporting project. We're also working with the Center for Reproductive Rights on reproductive rights in post-disaster emergencies. We collaborated with them on a joint submission, again, to the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women to inform a general recommendation that they're working on gender rights in post-disaster and climate change contexts. And general recommendations that are issued by the committee are kind of an interpretation of what the treaty provisions under the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We're also working with CRR and addressing child marriage through national human rights institutions. Some members of our team will have the opportunity to go to Nepal later this year to work with advocates and members of national human rights institutions in thinking about really how to address problems of child marriage in South Asia. We also do direct representation. We're representing a client in a pregnancy discrimination case, a very locally based case. We also are representing on the more kind of national framework 27 women and men who experienced sexual violence while serving in the U.S. military. And all of them filed were plaintiffs in two different federal cases. Both of those cases were dismissed under the Ferris Doctrine, which leads courts to refrain from deciding the merits of a case where the alleged violation was part of a military activity. And so, we are representing them and bringing a petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is arguing that their rights were violated by the U.S. government by failing to provide them redress, failing to provide them access to the courts. And then we also engaged with several United Nations bodies around these issues too. So what we actually would like to talk about today, though, is our project on domestic violence in Tompkins County, New York. So a very local project. I think when I founded the Global Gender Justice Clinic 2 years ago, I had a global focus. As you heard from my bio, I've always been engaged in global work. But I think it's really important that when we're doing work in human rights, that we see human rights violations as happening very much at home, and human rights as being applicable to the work that we do here. And so it was kind of from that perspective that I became interested in thinking about ways to bring human rights home to the local work that we might be able to do. And so I reached out to our local advocacy center, the Advocacy Center of Tompkins County, and began to explore some possibilities for projects in collaboration with them. And the project that we ended up engaging in really took on a life of its own. I think we thought that it might be a semester-long, a year-long project. Now we're into the end of our second year. We see this as now a long-term collaboration on issues of domestic violence and sexual assault in our community. And we really, I think, and the students can talk about their experiences, but I think have increasingly felt that we're part of a community endeavor. That this isn't something driven by the clinic. Maybe it was initiated by the clinic and the advocacy center, but it's really become a truly community-based effort. And so, the project is informed by, a recognition that domestic violence is one of the most pervasive human rights violations affecting women around the world. 35% of women worldwide face physical or sexual intimate partner violence. More than 1 in 3 women and more than 1 in 4 men in the United States have experienced some form of gender-based violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And yet, we know that these cases are vastly underreported. Less than 40% of women who experience violence tend to seek help. The local statistics are also stark. In New York State, more than 2.5 million women and 2.4 million men will experience domestic violence in their lifetimes. In 2013, 87% of women and men in New York State died as a result of intimate partner homicide. Sorry, I think that statistic's not quite right. 80% of, can you explain that stat? Okay, let's skip over that. We'll figure that out by the questions and answers. But anyway, I think these statistics are stark. 22.4% of all homicide victims had a domestic violence relationship with their murderers. And then the Tompkins County Advocacy Center receives more than 2,000 calls on its domestic violence and sexual assault hotline each year. And so that is, we're a really small community. Tompkins County is a tiny county, and yet our main service provider receives 2,000 calls on its hotline, I think is really telling. And again, our partners suspect, we feel that this is, only a small percentage of the incidents that really happen. Intimate partner violence is more than an individual problem. I think what we feel that the human rights perspective can help to bring to this problem is calling attention to the fact that this is really a community problem, and it's a violation of human rights. You know, human rights law is really about the obligation of states and of state governments. And so for a long time, domestic violence, intimate partner violence was thought to be kind of outside of the domain of law, of international law, of state responsibility. But I think there's been really a shift in understanding of the relevance of law to domestic violence. And human rights law says, you know, domestic violence isn't just a private matter. It reflects a failure on the part of the government to prevent. It reflects a failure on the part of the government and communities to adequately respond in many cases. And it's really, there is a right to be free from, under international human rights law, there is a right to be free from domestic violence. And there's a corollary responsibility of governments and of communities to take action to address it. So we kind of began this project with an appreciation of the Jessica Gonzalez or Lenahan case, the Castle Rock case. Are some of you familiar with that case? So this was a case in Castle Rock, Colorado, where a woman had been separated from her husband. Her husband had been abusive. She had an order of protection from the court against him. He one day came and abducted their 3 kids. She was really worried about her kids' safety. She called the police. She told the police that she had a protective order. Over the course of the night, she repeatedly called them. She went twice to the police station. She pleaded with them to help, and they basically didn't do anything. They told her she was overreacting. They told her to calm down and things would work out in the morning. You know, the night wore on. By the end of the night, it turned out the police finally encountered her estranged husband. There was a shootout. At the end of it, they found the 3 kids dead in the back of the car. It was never determined whether the estranged husband had killed them or whether they had, in fact, maybe been killed in the shootout. But you know, what was absolutely clear was that the state had failed in their responsibility to prevent and to enforce this restraining order. And so Jessica Gonzalez took the case all the way, and her lawyers took the case all the way to the Supreme Court, suing Castle Rock for its failure. The Supreme Court, in its decision, found that there had been no due process violation. The case was framed in terms of due process rights. It said that, you know, there was no enforceable property interest in the restraining order, even though the restraining order, you know, was ostensibly meant to be enforced. There was no constitutional right to having it be enforced. And so she had no remedy. You know, she went to the highest court of the land. Her lawyers at that point were ready to give up, but Jessica Lenahan said, you know, that can't be right. How can it be that what happened to me, that there's no violation here? And so she persuaded her lawyers to take the case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, kind of following the same strategy that we're using in the sexual assault, military sexual assault case. And, you know, after a long process, the Inter-American Commission came down with a very different decision. They framed the issue in terms of human rights. They said that her rights to life, non-discrimination, family life, due process to petition the government, the rights of domestic violence victims and their children to special protections, all of these rights have been violated. Not only had Castle Rock violated her rights, but the fact that the courts had closed their doors to providing a remedy was also a violation. And so, you know, intuitively, this seems much more of a logical decision. I mean, packaging the kind of violations, the kind of abuses that she and her children experienced in terms of due process rights, you know, suggests, at least to me, that that there's something missing in the way that our Constitution and our legal system is structured in terms of its ability to provide a remedy to survivors of domestic violence. And so really in response to the Inter-American Commission decision, this is a regional tribunal. It's not, it doesn't have the weight of an enforcement mechanism. There's no kind of standing police or army that enforces these decisions. And so even though the U.S. was found to be in violation and the Commission issued all of these recommendations, it's really been up to advocates to figure out how to ensure that this decision leads to meaningful change. And so there's been an increasing movement around the country to adopt local resolutions that recognize freedom from domestic violence as a fundamental human right. And it's the idea that, well, you know, if the U.S. as a whole, as a nation, is somewhat reluctant to embrace international human rights, is somewhat reluctant to enforce this you know, decision of a regional body, why can't we begin at the local level? Why can't we talk to governments at the local level every bit as much as national governments have a responsibility to do something about domestic violence? And in some cases, they may be much more receptive to taking action. And so we thought that this was, you know, a pretty exciting initiative, and we, in talking with our partners at the Advocacy Center, thought that this might be a way to provoke conversation and serve as a catalyst for meaningful change in our own community. And so we worked last year on drafting resolutions that recognize freedom from domestic violence as a human right. Our students drafted them. We went through lots of community feedback and involvement. We engaged in a tremendous amount of outreach. There was a petition circulated, a photo campaign where people held up signs talking about prevention for domestic violence means, you know, or freedom from domestic violence is a human rights because of XYZ, and put in their own views. We did petitioning, we did community events, and then we approached the legislatures. And so we went to the Tompkins County legislature, the Ithaca City, Common Council, a number of other local government bodies. And we really found that they were enormously receptive to the draft resolutions we proposed. And so over the course between November 2014 and March 2015, 6 different local government bodies adopted these resolutions, all making them their own, all, you know, changing them in some ways. Then the mayor also issued a proclamation in April of that year. So we really had seven different kind of government entities adopting these resolutions. And in fact, 2 of them weren't, or 3 of them actually weren't even at our prompting. We never approached the village of Cayuga Heights. We never approached the Lansing Town Board. But it just became such a kind of community groundswell of excitement about these resolutions that the governments took them upon their own initiative. I can give it just a little bit of a flavor of. We engaged in a lot of media outreach as well, and the media contacted us too. So here's just one example of the story that was brought on this initiative.
I think people see domestic violence generally, and unfortunately, as a private issue or a taboo issue where people don't talk about it. It's different than other violence. It's generally in the home, you can't see it, so if it's away from us, let's not talk about it. But I think by putting it on the table and talking about it and saying it is an international human right, we're taking that private issue and we're moving it into the societal square, the public square, and we're saying this is a societal problem that requires a societal solution. Every single person had an almost of course mentality about it, where they were saying, of course this should be a human right. And I've actually been really proud to be a member of the Tompkins County community because of it, because I think where there would have been a lot of pushback here, it was a really supportive, intellectually rigorous environment where we were able to really engage with every person on the issues, and I think we're really lucky that we got to do the project in Tompkins County itself. We're especially excited about the fact that we can work with community members, we can talk to employers and employees and see what they need. We can work with these really great legislators, and we can work with the Advocacy Center, and it's a really cross-collaboration, and we're looking forward to seeing what it looks like.
So yeah, that was the voice of one of our former students who was involved in the project. Here's just a little snippet of one of the resolutions, and when we shift speakers, I can send around a packet that has at the back of it you know, all of the resolutions that were adopted, so you can have a sense of what they looked like. Again, this is part of a nationwide momentum. I think there's about 26 local government bodies now across the nation that have adopted them. In New York, Albany has also adopted domestic violence resolutions. Tompkins County was really the first rural community that did so, and certainly the county that has the greatest number of government bodies that did so. I mean, we have 7 of the 26 in the country. So, why are the resolutions important? They affirm that freedom from domestic violence is a fundamental human right, that everybody possesses it just by virtue of being a human being. It moves domestic violence from the private sphere into the public domain. It says that this is a community issue. It needs a community solution. And it says that the government has a corresponding obligation to protect women and men from domestic violence and to provide remedies where this right has been violated. And so this leads to the question of implementation. These resolutions have been adopted throughout the country, but it's really only now that people are starting to think about, what difference does this make? How can we use these for meaningful change? And I have to say, this was something that was really both surprising and gratifying about our engagement with the local government bodies, that almost invariably when they adopted them, they said, okay, we're willing to do this, we're excited to do this, but we want to make sure that this isn't just a one-off, just a symbolic gesture, that this is actually something meaningful and leads to change. And so there was a lot of debate. We thought that there would be, pushback against the initiative, and really the only sort of pushback we got was, what difference can this make? What can we do? What can we do as a community? And so we turned the question kind of back and said, well, what do you think? What do you think we should do? And so there were actually two suggestions that came out of these conversations. And we have this year taken them on and working with partners have tried to take these two suggestions forward. So one of them came from the Tompkins County Council of Governments, which said, why don't we think about adopting domestic violence in the workplace policies that we could bring back to our local governments and that could inform, government employers and then private employers about how domestic violence spills over into the workplace and affects employees and provides guidance for us in terms of thinking about what to do. And so that's one initiative that we've undertaken. And then several of the resolutions themselves talk about contemplating a study of gaps and challenges in addressing domestic violence prevention and response in Tompkins County. And so just this semester, we've begun this study of gaps and challenges with the idea that this would really be a starting point, that we have to really understand what the problems are, what the accomplishments are, but also what the gaps and challenges are before thinking about actually what the next steps should be. And we're really excited that we now are partnering not only with the Advocacy Center, but also the Tompkins County Human Rights, Office of Human Rights, which is a governmental body, and the Tompkins County Human Rights Commission, which is an independent body appointed by the legislature. So it's really a community, private-public partnership, which we're really excited about. So I'll turn this over to my students to tell you a little bit more about their work this semester. But I will just pass around, again, this is our concept note regarding the implementation initiatives, and then at the back there's some examples of the domestic violence resolutions. And then here's an example, very much a draft, but of our domestic violence in the workplace policy or guidelines, and an accompanying toolkit, which Carolina will tell you more about.
So the objectives of our policy not only included making sure that the workplace was a safe environment for all employees, but also making sure that that victims had financial independence and were able to make a living and not have to perpetuate the cycle of being dependent on their perpetrator. We also wanted to provide protective measures for domestic violence victim employees and provide employer training so that employers could detect the signs of domestic violence at the workplace and help employees deal with these issues. So our drafting process for the policy was a comprehensive one. We looked at different policies from various New York counties and cities. We picked and chose language that we felt was inclusive and was able to sort of provide victims with, more stringent protection. And I want to talk about some of the sections from our policy. So one of the sections was non-discriminatory and responsive personnel practices for victimized employees. So this section, we pretty much, restated federal and state law that governs with respect to discrimination against victims of domestic violence. And we wanted to make this section particularly strong because we wanted employers to accommodate victims and sort of talk out what the issues are and sort of whether they need time off from work or whether they need to, move their parking space. We wanted to make sure that employers would have that conversation with their employees before terminating them or before firing them due to, diminishing work performance or any other consequences from a domestic violence incident. Confidentiality. So that was a very important section in our policy because without employees feeling comfortable to come to their employers and talk about very sensitive and personal, information, this wouldn't work. So our section reflects the fact that, at times, if an employee's safety is at risk, or if other employees' safety is at risk, they may have to divulge that information. But it also reflects that employers have to be sensitive and cognizant of their employees that are victims, and be confidential with that information and respect their privacy. Workplace safety plans for victimized employees. This was our longest section in our policy, and we really wanted to add more detail to provide an extra level of security for employees at the workplace and make sure that the Jessica Lanahan case doesn't happen again, and make sure that an employer is kept in the loop, for example, with safety and restraining orders, and making sure that security procedures are tailored and developed efficiently to the needs of the victims. Reasonable accommodations. So I touched on this earlier, but this section is very important. We sort of outlined steps that employers could take to accommodate employees who suffer domestic violence and need time off to deal with the repercussions. We used language that we had found from the Department of Justice, from the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, and from Legal Momentum, which is a legal advocacy group dedicated to women's rights. And we wanted to make this a strong section that pushes employers to use every possible way to accommodate employee victims and not fire these victims due to any domestic violence related absences. Modifying victims' employment benefits. So that section touched on, making sure that a victim is no longer receiving benefits, or that perpetrators of the domestic violence victim are no longer receiving benefits through that victim, and making sure that they're able to, receive financial compensation and receive their earnings independently. Accountability. This was a huge part of our policy, holding perpetrator employees accountable for committing domestic violence against employees, and also providing a procedure for reporting offending employees. Employee awareness, training, and education. So, we really feel that knowledge is power, and that by having events like this and sort of spreading information on domestic violence and what the procedures are in place in the workplace and in dealing with that is key. It doesn't require much extra funding, but can immediately make the employees, the employers, can make everybody sort of aware of potential issues that could be going on. And our last section was on monitoring the success of the policy. We wanted to make sure that there was a review process, and that employers were sort of looking over at what their strategies for helping employees and making sure that it's actually working, and that they're actually approaching these domestic violence issues in the right way. So our policy was a legal document. It included legalese. It included pages of text. it wasn't, the most fun document to read, as I'm sure some of you were reading it right now. It's not the most riveting. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to make a document that for the average reader would be really appealing and would make the policy easier to understand. So the toolkit is an accompanying user-friendly tool that explains sort of what the policy, what is in the policy, and is a tool for managers, supervisors, and human resources staff to use to implement the policy in their workplace. It has colorful charts, it has illustrations, it's fun to read. And yes, it mirrors the policy, discusses what domestic violence is, how to create a domestic violence workplace safe, a domestic violence free workplace. And I'm going to talk about some of the content in that toolkit. So the page that discusses how do we create a domestic violence free workplace. This page basically discusses, how managers, supervisors, human resources staff can implement an awareness campaign, whether it's spreading information in public spaces such as restrooms, whether it's creating an environment that's welcoming to employee victims to come in and talk about something that's going on. How do I help an employee who's experienced domestic violence? So the toolkit really breaks down what the steps are and sort of what the mind decision-making process is. We had a theme. We used 3 essential words that were sort of our reoccurring theme in our toolkit: assess, advise, assist. And these 3 words are used they're used for employers to remember and consider when deciding how are they going to help an employee who is experiencing domestic violence. Assess. So assess is about gathering the information about the employee's circumstances. If you suspect that an employee is a victim of domestic violence, you should first speak to them and sort of assess the information. And we sort of lay out, if the employee does confide in you, the topics that you can discuss, such as whether the employee has an order of protection, whether the employee feels safe in the workplace, whether the physical layout of the workplace should be changed to protect the employee and their needs. Advise. So advise is getting at having a conversation about the employee's rights and options. So here we talk about workplace accommodations, we talk about safety measures. A lot of times employees don't know what their rights are and what benefits they have in this situation. And so this step is a conversation where you explain to the employee that they can make changes in their employment benefits plan. They can talk about whether they need time off or whether they need to unfortunately, worst case scenario, terminate their employment. Assist. So assist is about creating a workplace safety plan. And workplace safety plans are really important as a safety prevention tool. And we've created sort of like a flow chart of the steps involved in that. Reduce victims' exposure to domestic violence, cooperate with orders of protection, protect victims' information. A piece of that is informing law enforcement, in the event that the perpetrator threatens the safety of the workplace, if they're coming by the workplace. So having that communication open. Keeping a picture of the perpetrator on file, so that other employees are aware of who the perpetrator is. Although the toolkit is intended for managers, supervisors, and human resources personnel, at the end of the toolkit there are pages that are addressed to employees specifically. So we have the Employee Bill of Rights page, and that page, and the scroll right there is the sort of the visual for that page. It lays out what the rights employees have with respect to domestic violence, so they can be empowered and advocate for themselves. The How Can Coworkers Help page, that page addresses the questions that coworkers might have with a potential, friend or coworker who's possibly a victim, and it provides sort of an example of questions that you can ask that are appropriate questions, and then it provides, a list of questions that might not be as appropriate or sensitive. And we also have on our last page of the toolkit a local and national resources page that highlights websites, phone numbers of hotlines that employees, employers, anyone that wants help or information can call to receive support. And now I will pass the baton on to Alex.
Thank you. So as Liz mentioned earlier, as we sort of presented the resolution to the Tompkins County Board, they kind of asked, what next? Where can we sort of focus our efforts further, more efficiently? And part of that process is creating a study that's baked into the resolution in order to find the gaps and challenges in terms of how well Tompkins County is responding and preventing domestic violence. And so this study is a county-wide approach where we sort of find what the county is doing right and find where there are gaps and challenges so that the study can improve, so the county could improve. There hasn't been any study like this before in Tompkins County. This is sort of a new thing. In 1996, there was a previous task force that sort of worked with the police department, with the Advocacy Center, which is a very great resource in Tompkins County to sort of help victims of domestic violence. But it's the main service provider, and it's stretched over budget and over capacity. Their calls have the amount of calls and the amount of activity that they've had has skyrocketed, increased greatly over the past few years. And so the question is, where can we take this and where can we more efficiently use our time? So back in '96, this task force came up with the IDV court, an integrated domestic violence court, which sort of brings in IDV, domestic violence issues, into one court so that one judge can sort of sort out the issues and find better tailored solutions to address issues of domestic violence within the same family. But this study moves a step forward from that and looks to find the exact sort of gaps and the exact sort of places where we can provide better support. And so obviously, why create a study? I mean, so there's a sort of misconception that victims of domestic violence are few and far between, but the opposite has been true. The Advocacy Center, the nonprofit that helps Tompkins County, has dealt with over 2,000 calls a year in terms of helping victims of domestic violence locally. And moreover, many sort of incidents of domestic violence go unreported to the authorities. And so overall, we want to create an implementation framework to sort of help provide results and provide remedies for the gaps that we identify. And these gaps are identified through a specific methodology. The methodology that we use is to use interviews, specifically interview key stakeholders in the community that have sort of qualitative interest and a very strong institutional memory of where Tompkins County is sort of not necessarily fraying at the edges, but missing key opportunities to help victims and key opportunities to prevent domestic violence. And so we take that qualitative data that we obtain from these interviews and use them to sort of code out precisely where we're finding these reoccurring issues throughout the county. And so these interviews are open-ended. The format is very flexible. So we provide the interviewee with enough opportunity to sort of make it their own and provide us with issues and gaps that they have themselves encountered. But at the same time, we structure it with a sort of standard set of questions so that we also provide a sort of control baseline for comparing one stakeholder to another. And obviously, we try to record them so that we have a good sort of background and a very fine study base. Moreover, these interviews are intensive. We really sit down and sort of nail out sort of iron out the issues that are occurring. They can last anywhere from 35 to 60 minutes, and in some cases have lasted longer because there's just so much to talk about in terms of space for improvement in Tompkins County. So the scope of the study is very broad. Any sort of stakeholder who has some effect on victims of domestic violence in Tompkins County is interviewed. So as you can see, this includes everyone from victims themselves to police enforcement agencies, to the colleges in Ithaca. There's 3 main colleges in Ithaca that all provide critical services for the community and for students to come forward if they are victims. So obviously the breadth of the scope of the study is very intensive, and we intend it to be so that our conclusions can have heavy weight and can have really good efficacy at the end of the day, strong efficacy. And so what kind of gaps are we finding currently? Well, precisely as the study set out to do, we're finding really critical gaps at junctures where hopefully you would want victims to have facilitated a process. For example, critically, there's only one legal service provider in Ithaca that helps victims of domestic violence specifically. They recently got a grant through the VAWA Act to help out victims, and even then the grant was limited to victims of sexual assault. To help victims of domestic violence more generally, they had to ask for a sort of expansion of the grant, of the sort of parameters of the grant. Even then, they're over capacity because there's so many folks coming forward asking for help, and many times due to sort of wooden income requirements that, in many cases, take into account the income of the abuser themselves, of their partner, they may not qualify for free legal assistance. So these issues can sort of hamper the victim's ability to attain justice. Obviously, there's mandatory court filing fees, which for someone who perhaps may not have employment or perhaps is struggling to maintain employment, can be an absolute barrier for justice. In order to enforce a protection order, there's a $75 court filing fee to file a claim with the court. For many folks, it's a matter of either making ends meet or trying to find and trying to enforce a protection order that, at the end of the day, may or may not be effective. Moreover, there's critical issues with housing. Many victims are unfortunately part of the low-income housing assistance programs, and so in these cases, when they come forward for assistance and ask to be separated from their abuser, the wooden requirements of the program requires them to maintain the same lease. In other words, they're on the hook for that same residence, and so it may be harder for them to sort of split the lease or find new housing and not have to be responsible for that lease. And of course, hostile landlords. We have landlords who can generally be not as sympathetic to the issues faced by victims. And so, of course, this would tie them to the lease and force them to have more contact with the abuser. And critically, when we went to the IDV court, we spoke with a judge there who noted that there had been previously plans to start a sort of common ground for visitation. As it is today in Ithaca, in order to hand off children for supervised visitation, most families either have to find some sort of venue or the library to sort of hand children off from one parent to the other. And this makes for very sort of nervous confrontations. I mean, if you're really close to or in close proximity to the abuser, this can lead to tensions sort of building up and new incidents occurring. So there's a lack of a sort of common ground where or a facility where a handoff can be made. And critically, there's a lack of case officers to sort of help monitor these issues. Case officers are critical because they're recording, monitoring, making sure that the abuser obviously stays within a certain degree of space away from the victim. And without that supervision, the abuser has more sort of leniency to break the rules and to get away with issues, which combined with the court filing fees, combined with issues like poor legal assistance, it can be a critical problem that's compounded by other factors. So I'd like to hand it off to Liz for our future goals.
Yeah, so we're really just like right in the middle of these two initiatives. With the domestic violence in the workplace policy, you know, we are just beginning now. We've finalized the initial drafts, and we're beginning to reach out to local government entities as well as some private employers. And you know, we've in just our kind of like initial reaching out have received a lot of interest, and so we're hopeful that in the coming months that we'll see some version of these documents, the policy and or guidelines, and accompanying toolkit getting adopted by both private and public employers. And you know, ultimately, you know, it would be great to see it take on impetus in other jurisdictions too. And you know, this actually dovetails with a statewide initiative in terms of there was an executive order by the governor of New York that mandated state employers, state agencies to adopt domestic violence in the workplace policies. And so state entities actually have these in place, but it hasn't actually spilled over to municipal employers or to county employers, except a few counties like Seneca County and Westchester County that kind of read the executive order as applying to them. But you know, for the most part, this is you know, something quite new. We, you know, we're just at the beginning of our study of gaps and challenges. We're hoping to, our kind of initial target for releasing the findings of the report was and is October of this coming fall, October 2016, in conjunction with Domestic Violence Awareness Month. You know, we might end up having to postpone it just because the more we look into the issue, the more we find that it goes really deep, and there's more. Every person we talk to points us to other stakeholders and other people we should talk to. We're thinking about or planning to do focus groups with survivors with the support of the Advocacy Center, as well as you know, other community-based groups. And so we feel that with both of these initiatives, certainly the outcome is important, the kind of final product and where that leads, but the process is every bit as important. And so, you know, we want to make sure that we do incorporate all voices and engage everybody who's interested in being involved. And then we're just really excited to see where these go. You know, with the domestic violence in the workplace policy, when I was just starting out my legal career and working for the IWJ, an NGO, you know, I was a coworker to somebody who was experiencing domestic violence, and she ended up being killed by her abuser. And that was something that has always, you know, informed the work that I do around gender justice and domestic violence. And, you know, I so wish that we had something like a domestic violence in the workplace policy to provide guidance to us in terms of recognizing the signs and knowing what to do. So, you know, I feel really personally affected by this policy and hope that it will be successful. And then the study, I think, you know, we've been asking the stakeholders we talked to about, you know, what do you think it was valuable to adopt these resolutions? What does it mean to you to recognize that freedom from domestic violence is a human right? And you know, the answers have been really thoughtful and thought-provoking, and so I think it will be interesting to see what, as a community, you know, we come up with in terms of identifying gaps and challenges, in terms of identifying solutions, and in terms of, you know, thinking about what can be gained by a human rights approach to these issues. So I'm really excited to see where this goes. And you know, as I said, what began as a 1-semester project or 2-semester project, I think is now a long-term commitment. And I think, you know, for as long as I can foresee, this type of work, kind of bridging the global and the local in Tompkins County and beyond, is going to be a part of the work that we do as a clinic and as a law school. So thank you so much. We really value we're so excited to be here, and we look forward to your questions and comments, as well as, you know, if anybody's interested in learning more, or thinking about pro bono opportunities, for example, you know, we'd love to talk with you more about that too. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Liz and Caroline and Alex, for coming. It is almost 1 o'clock, so for those who needed to leave at 1, maybe now would be a good time to do that. And then anyone who wants to stay for questions and answers, we can do that. So we'll just give folks a minute to do that. So I'll kick it off with a few questions, and then maybe we can open it up to the audience and the other offices. So I was wondering, actually, I do have some more questions about the domestic violence resolutions, but switching gears just briefly, I noticed in your 2015 annual report that you do some work in terms of researching courtroom procedures and how to prevent intimidation or further victimization of victims while they're testifying. That could be interesting. I mean, certainly for me in litigation, that's interesting to know what your findings were and your recommendations were.
Yeah, so this has always been of great interest to the judges we work with, as well as to the legal practitioners. And it's interesting that that there's different initiatives and different possibilities in different legal jurisdictions. And so, for example, the use of an intermediary with child witnesses and survivors of violence has been something that's been quite effective in some jurisdictions, such as South Africa. Someone who's able to, accompany the child or the victim and kind of translate what would otherwise be quite intimidating court procedures to them. The use of closed-circuit television, or in some jurisdictions where there's actually no funding for something like that, having a screen that provides some kind of buffer, from the abuser, but still allows for testimony and cross-examination. Having in-camera proceedings, having courtrooms that are set up in such a way that seem more friendly or that are not as intimidating. I think all of these are possibilities, but then some of them might not be as feasible here in the United States. Given our Sixth Amendment right to to confront your accuser. And so what we've heard from some of the U.S. judges and hearing about like an intermediary, for example, is what a great idea, but we couldn't actually do that here. So yeah.
Thank you. Speaking of judges in the U.S., I know that you do research for judges. That's one of the things the center does. Have you worked with any of the judges in our neck of the woods, Central New York, Western New York maybe, or the Northern District?
So not a whole lot. We have worked with judges in New York City and in Tompkins County. I think that's the one exception. So Judge John Raleigh, who was presiding over the IDV court in Tompkins County until very recently, was a great supporter of the work that we do and actually had gone to India with us and engaged with Indian judges and has participated in many of our conferences and hosted judges in Ithaca. And so we've had a long-standing relationship with him, as well as many of the women judges, mostly in New York City, but actually not in the rest of the state. So it certainly would be something we'd be interested in exploring.
Thank you. Let me see if anyone in the other offices has a question, and then I'll go to the audience here in Syracuse. Is there anyone out there who's still on? If you have a question, unmute your line and we'll hear you.
I have a question.
Who's that?
This is Dan Sharp in Buffalo.
Hi, Dan.
Hi.
Go ahead.
So I back maybe 45 years ago when I was in law school, this subject I don't think was brought up too often. I don't recall it at all. Your data and statistics are daunting. What I'm wondering, and my question is, are things worse today than they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago, or are things getting better?
Well, I can start off. I think when I think about the policy and the toolkit and the study, it seems that we're breaking ground with those initiatives, and that gives me hope that things are going to get better and hopefully are getting better from the past. So to me, I feel hopeful that things are improving.
I think I would agree with Carolina. I think it's really hard to actually measure, actual incidents of domestic violence locally and globally, just because reporting rates are so low.
and therefore to compare from the past to the future, and even to understand then what increasing, rates really means. And I think the story behind it is probably a complex one. But I think that there have been increased initiatives and increased, as we keep talking about in our initiative, like a bringing of this issue out away from the private sphere into the public sphere, starting to talk about it, starting to think about societal solutions. And so, I can only hope and think that this is contributing to progress.
I just want to note really quickly, from the experience in our study and with police departments, there's a sort of institutional change. One of these officers we worked with was a wonderful resource. He trains police departments all over New York State with regards to training for victim advocacy with officers. And he noted that when he started in the mid-'70s, a lot of his work was even encouraged within the department to sort of brush sort of DV issues under the rug, instructing even the abusers to sort of say, hey, take this inside your house, don't do this in a public place, and look the other way, sort of thing. But now things are sort of shaping up, and he's noticed that in his sort of tenure at his work, of more training for victims advocacy, more training to sort of assist victims and help them in a critical role, which is the first responders role. So from his experience, at least within our study, from what we found so far, he's found a very positive trend, not only in reporting, but in support.
Thank you. Great question, Dan. Any other questions from any of our other offices before I go to Syracuse? All right, so does anyone here have a question? Sure. Give you the mic, Jim.
Yes, Jim Fitzpatrick, I certainly want to thank you all for being here. It's been very, very helpful. I just had one question. I've been looking at the Avon Global Center for Women and Violence and so forth. And I know, Professor, you mentioned about Southern Africa. But if I could just see what the international focus is of the Avon Global Center, please.
Thanks, Jim.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Could you speak more to some of the international focus
Oh,
of the center does?
of the focus, the international work that we do?
Oh, yes, of Avon Global Center.
Yeah, so I think all of the clinical or most of the clinical projects that I mentioned are also undertaken in partnership with the Avon Global Center, and many of those have a global focus. From women in prisons in Jamaica to women's rights in Myanmar. We've worked on a number of fact-finding projects and in-depth studies and reports on, for example, sexual violence against girls in schools in Zambia, South Africa, and Kenya, acid violence in India, women in prisons in Argentina, as well as in New York. And so and the judges that we provide research support for and that we bring to our convenings of conferences and other events are very global. And so yeah, they're really from all over the world, but they also include judges and stakeholders from the United States too. And so we're global, but we very much include the United States and local issues as kind of part of our purview of global gender justice advocacy.
Any other questions? Anyone else? Sure. Here. Brody, why don't you start and then I'll...
Oh, someone behind me? You can start. Oh, go ahead.
Hi, I'm a 1L law student at Syracuse Law. My name is Astrid. Thank you guys for coming. So my question is, in terms of your employee policy or employer policy, have you considered those survivors who have children and what employers can do for their children or for the protection of their children? I think based on my experience working at DV shelters, the children can be very young, and so they may not have the protection of being in school for most of the day when their mom or dad is working. So I was wondering if there was any idea or concern about the children as well as the employee.
Thanks, Astrid.
Absolutely. That was part of the sort of issue with a lack of a sort of neutral ground where children can sort of have both handoffs between parents as well as a sort of daycare, because a lot of issues that, as you noted, parents have is finding new daycare or after perhaps moving to a new place, or perhaps having to change jobs and having to change schedules. So that was part of the a major sort of gap that we found, that not only finding the a good daycare place, which in Ithaca may or may not be rough, depending on who you know or how much money you have, honestly. The second issue is having employers give the employee time off to do that, to find a solution to have their kids taken care of while they're at work. And so we've notably that has stood out as an issue that Tompkins County also faces and has been with limited success, if any, sort of not really dealt with.
I think with the policy and toolkit, I think the hope is that many of the provisions will have an important protective effect on children too. So if employers are aware of and able to participate in the enforcement of protective orders, are able to point employees to important resources, community resources such as the Advocacy Center that do have access to support networks for children, specifically from shelters to other things, that will ultimately end up protecting children as well as the employees themselves. But we would certainly welcome other thoughts if from your experience you have any concrete suggestions about how we might incorporate children and concerns about them more specifically into the policy.
Thanks.
I was looking on your website, and you have a fascinating report, I think it's from last year, about different suggestions in the New York court process for the sentencing of victims of domestic abuse who end up, the victims of their crimes, a homicide or assault, end up being the abuser. And the thrust of it was, for people who didn't read it, was that there ought to be some flexibility in terms of mandatory minimums, and there should be some emphasis in terms of sentencing to take into account the fact that the person that they assaulted or attacked was the perpetrator of the domestic violence, and it should be taken into account. One thing that I noticed when I was reading it was it was a lot about sentencing and probation and parole and that sort of thing, but no suggestion in terms of a modification of the absolute defense in criminal law in New York for self-defense. And, it sort of occurred to me that sometimes politics makes strange bedfellows. It kind of feels like a lot of the same arguments for like a stand your ground kind of thing. Why should I leave my home? I should be able to defend myself. I just didn't know if that was strategic in terms of why there are no suggestions in terms of making a more accessible self-defense, absolute defense, or if that's something that you're still considering for the next report.
I think the others weren't involved in the report. So that's a great question, and I think really really great question. So when we first drafted this report, it was actually the first project that I undertook when I came to Cornell. I think we released it in maybe 2011 or something like that. And we were initially planning to focus on all of the different barriers to justice that domestic violence survivor defendants experience. And so the one that you flag was a key one, was the issue of self-defense. And we looked at a number of different barriers that come up throughout the trial process as well. We ended up deciding just to focus on post-conviction barriers, particularly the sentencing issues. I think largely for strategic issues and for I think reflecting the fact that there were so many different perspectives among the people we talked to and the advocates and co-organizers, co-authors we were working with in terms of what the solutions really should be for all of these different issues. And I think that the issue of sentencing was particularly pressing because there was pending legislation, as there's still pending legislation, that would restore discretion to judges in sentencing survivors of domestic violence who end up using force against their abusers or for whom the violence they experienced is directly related to the offense for which they're convicted. And so there was kind of a pressing need to make that point and get that information out there. That report was initiated by a judge who was particularly, a group of judges that were particularly concerned about this lack of discretion. And so I think we decided to keep the focus narrow with the idea that we would go back to the other issue later. We haven't yet done that, but I actually was just in New York City with talking about my Jamaica report on a panel with a lot of my old colleagues on the New York front, and it really kind of rekindled my view of the need to look at these issues in New York as well. So I think that may be to come.
Thank you. Any other questions?